Thanks for coming to our continuing virtual series at a time of pandemic, and on this occasion Babette Smith makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. She's well known to many of our members, but I should say she'll speak for about half an hour or thereabout, and then after that we'll do a question and discussion period with Anne Henderson and Babette Smith. But now Babette Smith, she's been writing about misconceptions concerning convict women since 1988, when she published A Cargo of Women, Susanna Watson and the Convicts of the Princess Royal. Her other titles include Australia's Birthstain and The Luck of the Irish, which won the 2015 New South Wales Premier's History Prize for Community and Regional History. And on this occasion, Babette Smith is going to talk to the Sydney Institute on the publication of her most recent book, a very finely produced book, How Australian Female Convicts Challenged Authority, Defiant Voices. So Defiant Voices, How Australia's Female Convicts Challenged Authority, which we will now hear about from Babette Smith.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Defiant Voices is an overview of the female convict experience in the Australian penal colonies from the start in 1788 to the end in 1853 in Van Diemen's Land, as Tasmania was then called. It pulls together the huge volume of research into the women, which has been done over the last 40 years. I'll briefly give some context as to why I took this approach, and then give some examples of how the female convicts used sound and voice to challenge authority, before concluding with some of the insights I gained by taking the chronological approach. First, we need to remember that while the male convicts transported to Australia numbered approximately 163,000, only 25 women were sent. Initially, they went only to New South Wales, but after Van Diemen's Land was established in 1803, a steady trickle was sent to the younger colony until 1820, when ships began delivering prisoners direct to Hobart. After 1840, when transportation to New South Wales ended, more women were sent to Van Diemen's Land, and over time, the number sent to each colony almost equalised. Throughout the colonial period, women remained scarce compared to men. Western Australia became an official penal colony in 1850, but from the start refused to take female convicts. Settlers needed the men's labour, but feared the depravity of the women, whose frightful reputation had by then been widely publicised. In fact, every way a convict researcher turned, the women were condemned. A chorus of outrage had created a bad reputation for all female convicts, which lasted unchallenged for more than a century. In the 20th century, historians still accepted their 19th century reputation as fact, one declaring infamously that they were not the kind of women who would attract men into marriage. A vigorous feminist defence was mounted in the 1970s, which created a new reputation for the women, but this time as passive victims of the male patriarchy. A fact that can easily slip from mind is how young the women were. Most were teenagers, 15, 16, 18, or their very early 20s. The recklessness of youth can be glimpsed in their actions and attitudes, as well as their preoccupation with things like clothes, with keeping their hair nice, with their determination to have fun, which usually meant drink and dancing and singing in the nearest pub or with the crew of a ship. Sex was part of this merrymaking, which quickly had them labelled as prostitutes. Sometimes that charge was accurate. The National Library's commission to write Defiant Voices made me reflect deeply on the historiography since my first book, A Cargo of Women, was published. In fact, I reread everybody's books and papers. When I started in research in 1982, We knew nothing about the women. All that remained in public knowledge were two stereotypes: that they were all whores, depraved, drunken sluts, an opinion that was loudly proclaimed during the colonial years in Britain as well as Australia. When free settlers arrived in numbers from the 1840s onwards, they perpetuated this idea, which lay undisturbed in our community consciousness for more than a century. The second stereotype was created in the 1970s through the vigorous feminist defence I mentioned, which resulted in this idea that they were passive victims. So in 1982, I went looking for real three-dimensional people. Academics and archivists told me firmly I wouldn't be able to recreate convict lives because the records had been destroyed. But by combining family history with academic scholarship and by devising a new methodology of sampling the vast convict archive by the boatload, I did. When A Cargo of Women was published in 1988, it proved groundbreaking. 40 years on, I'm being asked to write about the female convicts again. It brought me full circle. The National Library gave me an open brief, except for a request that I make the book accessible in style and keep it to 60,000 words, which was a big ask for me. Otherwise, the choice of how and what to write about the female convicts was entirely mine. Temporarily, I flirted with the idea of doing several boatloads of them, but I quickly dismissed that thought. The result would have been a kind of enlarged Cargo. Secondly, there was no point. In the years since I had written Cargo, others had researched women by the boatload, and their work was available for scholarly use. However, with the exception of some large-scale academic studies, such as Deborah Oxley's Convict Maids and later Kirsty Reid's examination of women at work in Van Diemen's Land, we had mostly all been working at the micro level. Surveying the literature since made it plain we had now accumulated a richness of detail about thousands of individual lives that would benefit from an overview. So I decided Defiant Voices would cover the full transportation period for women from the 1780s to the 1850s. However much you have researched there before, being an official NLA author, you feel like the whole vast treasure trove of the library's collection is at your feet, waiting to be mined for gold. The depth of the coverage about Elizabeth Fry surprised me. I seized in particular on her first report of the Ladies' Committee, which was published in England in 1821. She was a great strategist, and the report was as much a propaganda document to gather support for her prison activities as it was an account of what they'd done. From my point of view, its great value was a letter from Reverend Samuel Marsden, which it reproduced. When the Parramatta factory opened its doors on the 21st of February 1821, Elizabeth Fry was on Marsden's mind. I must just have a drink. The female factory was their joint achievement following years of persistent advocacy and pressure in Britain and Australia. Marsden wrote, quote, "A house of accommodation is at length provided for the female convicts and is open this day. I'm happy to say they are in my sight at this very moment, walking for the first time to their new habitation while I am writing this hasty line. They will not now be compelled to live in such scenes of human misery and vice as they have hitherto done." Whatever you may think of the impact of the reforms advocated by people like Fry and Marsden, there's no doubt these two were well-intentioned. And that letter is a really useful discovery because we had the reply, and the female factory group, the Friends of the Female Factory, used the reply at the recent 200 anniversary of the opening of the factory, but they didn't have Marston's original letter, so now they do. Another example from the library's collection, which I must mention, is the Journal of Captain Colnett R.N., written in 1803, which yielded a gem when he noticed the change in the women's appearance after time at sea. It confirmed they were getting benefits of a sea voyage. They came on board, he wrote, with despair, disappointment and anxiety stamped on their faces. But later in his journal, midway through the voyage, he added, the ladies daily improved on their jail countenances. Health and content were apparent on their faces. So in pulling back from individual close-ups of the women, which had so engaged us for so long, I found their voices, the scale, depth and impact of them, which is not apparent when your subject is one woman. Then I went looking for more. For example, among the first examples of the women standing up for themselves in surprising circumstances were 6 women sentenced to death at the Old Bailey in 1789 who refused to accept a pardon. They had all been tried separately, but this day they shared the dock as the judge announced that each had been granted a pardon on condition they were transported for life. The law at the time required that each formally accept. No one was more surprised than the judge when, one after the other, they shook the system by refusing mercy. No, said Sarah Coward, I will die by the laws of my country before ever I will go abroad for my life. Martha Cutler echoed her, I will sooner die. 2 others followed, saying the same thing. The judge tried intimidation. If you do not accept the king's pardon, it will be too late. Depend upon it. Every woman who now refuses will be ordered for immediate execution. His scaremongering had no effect. The women were returned to jail and brought up at the next session several weeks later, where they were joined by 2 others. Jane Mills told the judge, my lord, I will not accept it. I will die first. Anyway, I think I've suffered hard enough to be in jail for 3 years. Mary Burgess was equally adamant, telling the judge, I'd rather die than leave my husband and child behind me. I am very willing to die. Consider what you're about, replied the judge. It's my duty to give you notice. You will certainly be ordered for immediate execution. This stalemate lasted for several weeks until someone behind the scenes persuaded the women to concede. Their defiance, however, made a lasting impression. A few years later, the Crown changed the law. From 1797, a convict was no longer required to accept a pardon. It could be conferred whether you wanted it or not. Far from being powerless, passive victims, convict women used their voices, their every kind of sound, from clapping, stamping their feet, wailing, shouting, to inflict an oral torture on others. As late as 1852, and despite the heavy impact by then of penal reforms, they were still doing it. The ship's purser on the Duchess of Northumberland recorded, after a fight among them, caused by an early lockdown below with the hatches closed, they raised such awful yells that it was truly horrible to hear them. Fancy the lungs of 250 well-conditioned women. The crew threatened to scuttle the ship if they were not quiet. The most violent women were put in irons. Thoroughly enraged, the mate was very violent to several of them. One gave him such a tongue-whacking that he was trying to gag her, but she caught his fingers between her teeth and bit them to the bone. He struck her most violently in the face. At this unmanly act, there was a great shout amongst the women. A formal inquiry was held on board subsequently, at which the mate was severely reprimanded. But it didn't need a huge mob to disturb others. The transport ships were tiny. A lady like, say, Elizabeth MacArthur could hear everything that happened on the deck above, on the deck below, or through the thin partition that separated her from the women. She would have lain sleepless through events like the following, where a ship's surgeon recorded: "Found 4 women in the forecastle, put them in handcuffs for the night and kept them on the poop deck, where they kept singing most doleful ditties till morning." And on another occasion, "Put Margaret, alias Mog Collins, into solitary confinement for making a disturbance. She spent the night keening to the entire ship that it was all serene." Imagine trying to sleep with that occurring every 10 minutes. A successful large-scale disturbance at Cascade's female factory in Hobart in 1842 was achieved entirely by noise. It was triggered by an instruction that the women were to have absolutely no communication with men who were repairing pipes in the wash house. To enforce this, the women were confined to their day rooms rather than being let out in the yards. By mid-afternoon, about 150 of them had reached frustration point. They began singing, dancing, shouting, clapping their hands and stamping their feet. The matron made several futile attempts to get them to quiet down. Foolishly, she also pressed for the names of the ringleaders, which generated a display of solidarity. "We're all alike," they yelled. "We are all alike." Her husband's entrance was loudly hurrahed, but he did no better. Superintendent Hutchinson's first threat was to withhold their gruel, which produced an even greater clamour until he backed out. He had brought the police with him, however. According to the district constable, the women kept up a tremendous clatter with their tongues, but he still managed to hear one of them shout, "Here's the bloody traps." Verbal resistance did not just occur on the ships or collectively in the factories. The women were just as vociferous in the workplace. Historically, you can see how their indignation at being told what to do evolved. The departure of Governor Macquarie in 1822 marked a turning point to develop the colonies and, most importantly, to defray the expense of convict transportation. The British government decided to foster the emigration of men with capital. As encouragement, they'd be given free land grants and a free convict workforce. These new self-funded settlers and their families began arriving in New South Wales and Van Diemen's Land from the early 1820s. They, rather than the government, now became the major employer of convicts. And they found themselves confronting a female workforce who were traditionally used to running their own race. Mainly bachelor employers in the early days, then a mix of emancipists and occasional free settler couples under Governors Macquarie and, in Hobart, Lieutenant Governor Sorrell. And now, not just a gentleman master, but a lady mistress too. They were not what their servant was used to. Wherever they were in the penal colonies, the women were determined to make their employers behave in a way they thought appropriate. Workplace conditions should conform to their servants' standards. The women's scarcity gave them power in the workplace. For the first time in their lives, they were not afraid of being dismissed without a reference. There was always another job waiting. And if they didn't like their current placement, they would engineer a return to the female factory. Many, in fact, just walked off the job after a dispute with their mistress. They hated, for example, being over-regulated. Niggled at was how they described it. Niggling every day, said one woman. Another reported, if I was allowed to do as I thought fit, and my mistress did not find fault, I dare say we might manage to get on. Running a colonial household was heavy work. In 1827, Mrs. Robert Lethbridge wrote, "I cannot do without 3 women at present on account of all the washing. We wash everything at home, and what with the dairy, poultry, baking, making candles and so on, we find plenty to do." These ladies were usually young mothers as well. They were desperate for help. If necessary, they would try bribery in the form of clothing or jewellery or bonnets. But their servants were picky. A lady could easily transgress her servant's fashion sense and feel the full force of her tongue as a consequence. "Bombazine, is that all you can give me? Do ye think I'll wear such stuff?" The battle of wills between servant and employers never ceased. According to Superintendent of Convicts Josiah Spode, who was right in the middle of this power struggle, the women, he said, all feel they are working under compulsion, which renders it almost continual warfare between their employers and themselves. For many years, we assumed that overwhelmingly convict women were sexually exploited by their masters. Although this undoubtedly did happen, further research has revealed that it could also be a question of who was exploiting whom. One master offered his servant £2 if she would have sex with him, and then she reported him to the magistrate. On the other hand, there are examples of women charging their fellow servants 10 shillings for sex. After 40 years' investigation, it's plain that convict women were involved in every kind of sexual encounter, some of it, sadly, of the gross kind being rape, and occasionally gang rape. But otherwise, they were involved for the fun of it, for defiance, for love, or to further their own goals. Were they prostitutes? No one can answer that dogmatically. At most, yes, sometimes. But their sexual mores were different from the observers who labelled them. And Michael Sturmer's early conclusion basically holds 40 years on. Their reputation as prostitutes lay, quote, in the eye of the beholder. Certainly we can stop worrying on their behalf that they were exploited. Given a chance, they might well tell us, as one did a magistrate in 1814, "It's my thing, and I'll do what I want with it." The women's successful resistance in the workplace and the factories was widely recognised at the time. An exasperated master, whose servant absconded wearing the new clothes he had bought for her, wrote in 1839, quote, "In point of fact, there is no adequate punishment for the women. At the crime class they sneer, at the wash tub they laugh, and the cells they ridicule. We do not advocate severity, but we do wish to emphasise the absolute necessity of instituting some plan of punishment which will induce the female convicts to deport themselves properly, or at all events to deter them from conducting themselves in the heedless, careless, unruly manner in which they delight to do at present." He was bleating in the wind. The more punitive the authorities became, the less seriously the women appeared to take them. Despite the harshness they experienced in Australia, the prisoners established a community of disrespect, irreverence, and equality where no person dared act as though they were better than anyone else. People were admired for who and not what they were, and for how they admired in Australia. How they behaved in Australia. Newcomers were expected to leave their past behind, just as a nation of criminals had left theirs, and to take on the cultural assertion of equality. Gentlemen knew the rules. In the late 1890s, the retiring Bishop of Tasmania told his students in England, quote, "Make sure to clean your own boots when in Australia, and learn to shoe a horse. Don't use the affected voice or manner, and never speak about the lower classes. Australians don't like it. The women convicts were not passive observers, but active creators of this culture. Essentially, Australia was a nation made by the working class. It was the land where the people won. Writing a chronological history provides insights in addition to recognising the scale and volume of the women's defiance. Just to summarise briefly, inevitably I compared the two penal colonies and realised that some detailed studies now, which contrasted them, would be useful. For example, the outcome for children who were sent to the orphanages. Secondly, more work needs to be done on the earliest colonial period in both colonies. Grace Karskens has done some sterling work, but it's mainly centred around the Hawkesbury, and it does not enlighten us greatly on the characters, the politics, and the behaviour of the early colonial Europeans. I was surprised by the scale of those notorious concubines who began relationships with First Fleet officials and soldiers in the camp at Sydney Cove. How domestic they were, how affectionate. Surgeon Thomas Jamison, for instance, took Elizabeth Colley, his mistress, and their 5 daughters back to England. So did other men. Judge Advocate Richard Atkins, who was the black sheep of an aristocratic family, took Mary Beckwith home and married her when his lawful wife died. They are buried together in the family vault. And who knew that Governor Phillip had a mistress who was in the colony? For all his lamentations about colonial morals, Reverend Richard Johnson never mentioned that. Another revelation to me was the different community reaction to female convicts in New South Wales compared to Van Diemen's Land. This insight was revealed, for example, by the rapturous welcome given to the women from the Parramatta factory, who twice in consecutive years abandoned their overseer in order to attend the local races. When they rushed onto the course, they were received with cheers and applause as they bowed and waved like actresses on a stage. An overview does confirm historian Lyndall Ryan's opinion, expressed in the 1980s, early 80s, when she wrote that the women's experience differed according to the time and place they arrived. For the women, the earliest colonial years in both colonies were largely unregulated and left room for individual decisions about how to manage their lives, including their children. This period, however, was followed by a sharp imposition of morality and extra regulation under Governor Macquarie in New South Wales and Lieutenant Governor Sir George Arthur in Van Diemen's Land. Life on assignment to big pastoral estates dominated the years from 1820 to 1840 and was similar in both places. The idea of a penal system was supposed to be at its peak during this time, but as I found in Cargo of Women, individuals found cracks in the system through which they could follow their personal goals. It was also a time of considerable overt resistance in the workplace by both male and female convicts. New South Wales ceased to be a penal colony in 1840. During the final decade in Van Diemen's Land, the ideas of evangelical reformers were imposed on the prisoners in a crushing regime that aimed not just to make the women behave differently, to stop swearing, stop getting drunk, dress modestly, for example. In the closing decade, punishing routines designed to modify their behaviour continued, but now the aim of reformers was, quote, subduing their minds and taming their spirit. They kept resisting, as we saw with that riot on the ship as late as 1852, but it became more sporadic, and around it, everyday life was getting harder to resist. The relentless application of penal theories took its toll, and it's sobering to see how the self-confident exuberance of the ladies in the camp at Sydney Cove gave way to women who had been silenced, squashed even, to the point that one of them cried, "I am not allowed to live or exist." This contrast gives rise to another sobering insight, which is starkly obvious when you write a narrative version of the female convict story. I'll just explain by reading the closing sentences of the book where I wrote, quote, "Understanding the lives of women convicts is important for Australians who live with the echo of their experience. But their story also has profound significance beyond the national. As a chronological study makes clear, the history of Australia's female prisoners provides a case study for the global subjugation of women from which we are only now recovering." I wrote those closing words in the latter part of 2019. In the light of the terrible revelations about Australia's sexual culture over recent months, I wonder now if echo was strong enough. Should I have said the enduring legacy? Are we paying the price of an unexamined life here, in this case, unexamined history? It's a subject I intend to explore further. Thank you.
So many thanks to Babette Smith, and as I said, this is on the occasion of, as I said earlier, of the publication of Defiant Voices, How Australia's Female Conflicts Challenged Authority, and we'll have signed copies of that book for sale on our website very soon. And now we come to questions and discussion between Anne Henderson and Babette Smith. Thank you.
Babette, that was fabulous, as the book is.
Thank you.
I must say to anyone listening or watching, this is a beautiful book. The illustrations, of course, being from a library sponsorship, you've got the most amazing collection of not only the words and the data that you've done, but the illustrations are extraordinary. And even the letters, where some of these women could actually write quite well.
Helping to choose the illustrations was one of the joys of the book.
Would have been. Were they mostly from the library or some from
other? A very
other?
large number were from the National Library's collection, because the purpose of publishing for them is to draw on their collection.
Yes.
But they didn't put any limit on, where the images could come from. Some come from other libraries, like the Mitchell, for example. But many came from family historians as well.
Yeah, I noticed the letters, some of the letters. Well, it's always struck me as an extraordinary thing Australia is. I can't think of any other sophisticated global society that began with the absolute penury and penalty of Australia. Can you? Is there anything?
As far as I know, there is no other.
It is extraordinary. And so can you take us back to the sort of backgrounds these women particularly came from? Some of the stuff in the book with their language is, well, it would be pretty good, pretty hot stuff now on Facebook. They were really quite adept at using lewd language to shock and horrify their authority figures. So, but what sort of backgrounds do they come from?
Look, they were the lowest of the low socioeconomic group in Britain and Ireland, at a level where they might get some piecework, perhaps a piece of lace to do, some sewing, but they weren't regularly employed. And if they couldn't work, they couldn't eat. My own ancestor, Susanna Watson, who was convicted in 1829, she told the judge she stole because she couldn't bear to see her children starving. And I'm sure that was the case for many other women who just didn't have the same eloquence.
Yes, it wasn't just Dickens, they really were starving.
No, it wasn't just Dickens.
So then what was it like on the ship? I mean, you said that, and I noticed this when I was reading it, that actually it was like going on a cruise. It wasn't anything like being a real cruise today, but they actually became healthier in the air. No doubt they got better food. Maybe they were cleaner in a small way. What were the conditions like on the ships?
Well, I don't want to give the impression there weren't hard times on the ship, because of course there were. but on balance for the women as opposed to the male convicts, I think there were more benefits than disadvantages. There is a record that says that they really valued the predictable food and the fact that they had a bed to lay their head on each night. And this had not been the case at home. They would get up in the morning not knowing if they'd be able to eat that day, let alone where they'd sleep that night. So that was step one. Step two, as that lovely naval captain recorded, the benefits of a sea voyage did kick in, because after a while they acquired the benefits of sunshine and fresh air, which they didn't get in hovels in Ireland or rookeries in London either. And because it was a female convict ship, because apart from the very earliest ships, most were sent just women only, they didn't put a military guard on the female convict ships. So they were more likely to be carrying passengers, hence the shock and outrage. But it also meant that the women were able to spend almost all day, every day, weather permitting, on deck. And the surgeons, who believed that a clean ship and a clean convict was the basis to good health, made a point of keeping them on deck, on scheduling singing, dancing, and in one case, trotting exercises on the deck, which must have been hilarious
like
to
playing
watch.
quoits in there.
Yes, that's right.
So did they have to do any menial tasks? Were there any penal sort of bits to it?
Well, first of all, they had to do the kind of daily tasks which were for their own maintenance.
Yes.
They had to cook their own food, for instance. And there is a record of one of the a crew, I think it was a surgeon, admiring the intrepid nature of the women cooks who came on deck in the worst weather and struggled to keep their fires alight and so on. And then other women came up to help them do some of the necessary chores. So they had found their sea legs by the time he wrote this and were quite courageous in coping with doing the cooking 3 times a day. They were also responsible for cleaning the prison deck and the quarters they slept in. And every woman also had to begin the day by rolling up her bedding in netting and getting it off the wooden bed structures they slept on. So there was basic personal maintenance, plus the surgeon urging. They had baths, which were a novelty to some women prisoners.
Didn't know what soap was.
Yeah, no, that's right. But on the other hand, one surgeon did at least form a nuanced judgment in saying, you know, it depended on their attitudes and in some cases their education, their attitude to cleanliness.
Yeah. And some had children?
Yes, I think this is a subject that perhaps historians have overlooked, because there were always children on female convict ships, and sometimes there were very large numbers.
Really?
Yes.
Because many had to leave their children behind too.
Of course, that was one of the great tragedies of transportation.
So how did they make the difference? It's just up to the judge?
The policy, if there was one, varied over years. Sometimes it was up to the judge, although in one case in Ireland, it required the governor of the jail in Cork to give approval for a woman to take her particular children. At other times there was a rule that they had to still be breastfed or they had to be under 6 years old. It varied. But on balance, I think nobody's done the research to actually calculate the difference in numbers of the children. On balance, I think the authorities favoured sending out as many children as possible with their mothers. And in the early days, they sent out some of the boys with their fathers.
Oh, really?
And ships the size of, say, a Sydney Harbour ferry could, in addition to the 100 or sometimes nearly 200 convict women, be carrying 80 children.
Yeah, that's
Imagine
amazing.
the bedroom.
So, well, exactly. hadn't really got any sleep at all.
No.
I guess they would have to have some sort of activities for the children, classes, whatever. Or would they give them tasks?
Yes,
to
there's
do?
no record of them arranging games. Maybe they did the trotting exercises with their mothers.
It beggars belief.
Yes. Later on, they began to educate the children, and one surgeon in particular, expressed great surprise at the amount of intelligence they possessed.
Well, that's right. Yeah.
But nearby, their mothers were watching, and they asked for the elementary books that had been given to their children. And one of their number, who could already read and write, taught about 8 or 9 of them on this particular voyage.
So they came
to read and
ashore,
write.
with extra skills.
Yes.
Now, the story of Darcy Wentworth is obviously repeated down the line. I mean, he took a convict mistress even before he got on board ship, and he wasn't a prisoner. He was just going, he was exiled.
Yes.
And he had another convict, another convict wife in the end, and that was the second one when she died. How much did the upper class soldiers, governors, whatever, prevail on the women to be their women? Because obviously they had mistresses in the colony. And from your book I gathered there were a number of cases you turned up where a more senior man could prevail on a man to give up his wife because he wanted a woman. Did this happen a lot?
These relationships in the early days are an absolutely fascinating story. When they decided that, it was Governor Phillip's instructions to settle Norfolk Island also as soon as possible after they arrived at Sydney Cove. Women were asked, they'd obviously been observed, and Lieutenant Philip King, as he was then, knew who he would like to go to Norfolk Island with him, but they weren't coerced. They could choose not to go, but 5 of them went to that first settlement at Norfolk Island. All of them formed advantageous relationships. And back in the main colony at Sydney Cove, the same thing was happening. It was a case of attraction and pragmatism, particularly for the women, like on the ships. It meant, predictable shelter, good rations.
Yeah, it's a bit like a mail-order bride from China.
Yes, indeed, that's
That
right.
happens.
And of course, if you look really closely at the period, as I mentioned in the talk, you find that Governor Phillip was doing the same thing. He had a mistress in town as well, who was somebody else's wife. And he had hijacked her because the man was a bosun on the ship that Phillip was captaining.
Senior position.
Yes, and this had been a relationship that began as far back as 1783, so it wasn't new. But both husband, the bosun, and the wife were in Sydney Cove.
And
the
she traded her wares.
Yeah, she did, yes. But who knew that?
Well, it is. I mean, what I noticed with the book, and you mentioned it in your talk, is that the early settlement is really without boundaries. They're there, they're in the middle of nowhere. Okay, there are people with orders from high command in London, whatever, but they've got to make do with the world that they have to survive in. And so a lot of it is on the spot.
Yes.
And so the high morality of whatever we call Victorian England or whatever is already giving way. Is this part of the way in which we shape our future in Australia?
Yes, I think so. There were a lot of important practices that began in that early camp, as it was. They were more 18th century than 19th.
Okay.
The assumption that a senior man in one of the services could hijack a subordinate's wife, that's very 18th century.
Is it? Oh, even back home?
Yes,
oh.
yes, yes. So I don't know exactly when it became frowned on, but it was sometime as the 19th century
So they're extending
progressed.
the liberties?
Yes, yes.
I see.
So also, life on the ships for 6 months created a great familiarity, even among the prisoners and the officers.
Yes.
And you can see that in the actual criminal court proceedings on land once they arrive at Sydney Cove. Some of the charges brought against the women are by offended officers from the ship who they've cheeked. And And Philip, thank goodness, was a very mild-mannered man, even though I believe he had the necessary ruthless qualities to lead an expedition like the First Fleet. You couldn't be a sook or a pushover in that situation, but he was otherwise very mild-mannered. And in these criminal proceedings where a woman was brought to him, he was in fact the avenue for appeal, and she'd been sentenced to flogging. And it turned out the crime, so-called, was cheating one of the officers of the ship. He would commute the sentence. So,
flogging women almost sounds unbelievably harsh. I mean,
yes.
they're tough cookies and all the rest of it. Was there a different view about flogging women? I mean, the man on the ship who got in trouble for hitting a woman prisoner,
Yes.
there was obviously this notion that you didn't physically, certainly in public, abuse women in your official capacity. So what about the flogging, which is an extraordinary thing
yes,
to behold?
they finally prohibited flogging women in 1817. So that is, 30 years after the First Fleet arrived. Women were whipped like other prisoners in England.
Yes.
So it wasn't an extraordinary punishment. It was a question of the severity, the number of lashes. What the men didn't do, which does reveal an ambivalent attitude towards flogging women, they didn't record the kind of details they tended to do when they watched a male flogging, about when they cried out, what kind of noise they made.
Actually, you make the point that a lot of the women in their defiance would not cry out.
No, that's exactly right. Nor would they cry in court.
And yet they would use their voices when they weren't.
Yes, that's right.
Was this a sort of union thing, a camaraderie? Did they plot this, plan this, or was it just they knew it would work?
I think it was a case of they knew it would work. It wasn't premeditated. It was a spontaneous response. They could render the men totally paralysed with indecision.
Because they didn't know how to control it.
No, they didn't.
Yeah. What were they put to do? I mean, obviously they didn't sit in cells. All that notion of prison, it was the whole place was a prison. So what were the sort of things that women did? And of course they coupled. They found husbands. They often were left land after they got ticket of leave and so forth.
Yes, well, particularly from Governor Macquarie's arrival, lawful marriage became a policy of the government that they greatly encouraged. In fact, they virtually bribed all those illicit relationships from the earlier years. And those couples, including Darcy Wentworth and well-known figures, actually got married when Macquarie arrived. And that policy of encouraging marriage for the female convicts continued right through. It was a little more flexible and popular in New South Wales than in Van Diemen's Land, where it tended to be treated as a reward for good behaviour. Whereas in New South Wales it was, oh yes, that solves that problem. Get that woman married, you know. She was off the hands of the government and under the control, literally, of her husband.
Yeah. So the sort of things that women convicts did, it was servants' work.
Yes.
What else would they get? I suppose they were part of farming, were they?
Well, they were, and what you might call, I suppose, light outdoor work like dairy, milking cows, minding poultry.
I suppose the same as they would have done if they'd had a normal life in rural England.
Well, if they'd been able to get a job, yes, but none of them could really.
But out here they did have work.
They absolutely did,
and kept them out of trouble.
Up to a point, yes. Don't remember again that teenage girl thing.
Yes, very young.
Milking cows, very boring compared to being able to sing or dance or have a drink.
True. But then there was that horrible... Well, of course, let's go on to what happens later, because as the settlement became more, what would you call it, respectable, more and more free people came out. They encouraged women to come out as wives for husbands. It seems to me from your book that the role of the female convict got harder. They were put into these factories. They didn't have as much freedom to dance and sing. In fact, dancing and singing in the Methodist way was frowned upon and seen as an act of insurrection. So, and then the other thing that struck me, especially in Tasmania, in the factory in Hobart, Cascades or wherever it was, they used to make the children come off their mothers, breastfed mothers, at about 6 months, and then they would inevitably, most of them died, or lots of them died.
Yes.
Tell us about what happened later to these women.
Well, there had always been a policy of separating women from their children in both colonies, because, of course, the employers felt that if a woman came to them as a servant and had a child with her, that was a great impediment to her good work for them. So in New South Wales, it meant that when your child reached 3 years, they would require you to send it to the orphanage. And there was an orphanage for girls and boys. In Tasmania, that became an even more severe policy, where they started taking children away when they were weaned. And then, goodness knows, anyone who's been a mother knows, a just weaned child suddenly going on to solids and being separated from its mother abruptly. Many of them sickened, largely with diarrhea, and died. So tragic. It's a tragic story, and there's a lot of work being done, but I think that there's some really useful work now. If someone would do a big comparison between the orphanages in both colonies and the outcome for the children.
And did they eventually realise this was the reason children were dying?
Yes, but they would then move to new premises, but the same thing would happen. And it took, I think, until about 1860 before some medical man was a strong enough advocate to bring about change in the treatment and diet of the children to at least lower the deaths.
So how long were these orphanages there for? I mean, transportation stops about what? Western Australia goes on after 1850.
But took no women.
But then there were a lot of women that would have, from 1840s, would have been incarcerated for some time. When would the orphanages have started to shut down?
I don't think they did before the 1870s or 80s. There was a long tail to transportation. Yes. There were men still serving life sentences in New South Wales 10 years after transportation had officially ceased. They all received conditional pardons in the end. The same thing happened in Tasmania, a long tail through to, in some individual cases, through to the 1880s.
Yes, in the early 20th century there it was still very much there in people's backgrounds. And of course in Tasmania, transportation meant that there was not a lot of jobs for people who wanted to get a proper wage. The gold rushes dragged them away, mining dragged them away. Because if you wanted someone on the land, you just got a convict, you got a few convicts. That was the other problem with transportation.
Well, yes, but on the other hand, for employers, it was the dilemma, because they had to pay free migrants.
Oh, well, that's the point.
Yes,
so the man who was looking for a job, and it particularly affected Tasmania. So overall, these women, when they get put up against the women that came later as free women, how did this sort of female convict cohort, how did that change the way in which the new women coming into Australia would see themselves? I mean, had they changed the attitude towards women? Or they had gone back to being respectable married types?
The colonists made the mistake of thinking, and so did people back in Britain, that if there were new, poor, immigrant women assisted to migrate to Australia, they would be a better type of female than convict women. That proved not to be the case. They were from the same socio-economic group, with the same culture. And so from 1830, when bringing out the occasional boatload of free immigrant women began, through to the 1850s, when people were still doing it, there was mostly little difference between the immigrant or the convict women, and there was lots of intermarrying between the immigrants and the convicts. This thing about the men never finding female partners, they were marrying female immigrants from very early on. So at that level, it didn't make all that much difference, although I've got a lovely example somewhere, I don't think it's in this book, it's in another book, of a convict woman complaining bitterly that the arrival of the free women was reducing the chances of convict women's choices for marrying.
Well, there you go.
So there was some perception that they were being disadvantaged, although there's no evidence they really were.
And then, of course, the melting pot moved on. We had gold, we had land, we had exports.
And later there were some more genteel female immigrants who came as governesses and so on.
And not all those female convicts were quite so rugged and boisterous. You've got some examples of some fairly upright, good settler types in there who, the minute they got a chance to have a go, were models of immigration.
They were streetwise, smart, worldly women. And many of them recognised a good chance from much earlier on. One woman was writing from Sydney Cove in 1806, telling her daughter that this is the garden of the world, make sure to get out here. And a little bit of research shows the daughter turning up a few years later. Mary Reeby recognised a chance very early. My own ancestor said that, except for the fact she had to leave her 4 children behind, who she never saw again, transportation was the best thing that happened to her.
Well, it wasn't too bad for Australia either, was it?
No, it wasn't.
Except we now are trying to work out the older Australians joining we new Australians. But anyway, look, you've done a fantastic job here. This is, it's a real eye-opener. It's an easy read, and it's a beautiful book. Thanks very much, Babette.
Thank you, Anne.